What up, fam? It's your boy Demuir here, purveyor of all sounds underground. Hope all is good with y'all out there in the electronic music world. Um, I think in my last producer tip video, I spoke about how to get, you know, clarity of samples over um, other dirty samples. So, in particular, vocals over dirty samples, and I showed a automation technique with a little bit of EQing that gets you there. But then I got to thinking, for some of you guys, like, what if the sample is just really, really dirty, and how do you overcome the challenges with that if the sample, in particular, in this case, the vocals, are something you really want to put into your production? So I'm going to show you a technique called surgical EQing. And what I mean by surgical EQing is it's a very specific solve. And in the case of the vocals, it's a very specific solve for bothersome frequency. We're talking about vocals here, but I mean you can apply it to if you have a bad sample on a dirty kick drum or a snare you lifted somewhere and it's just not coming off the way you expect it. I'm going to show you it from the technique from two different perspectives. I'm going to call it a high-end perspective, and I do not intend to be pompous in any way. It's just that, as I spoke before in other videos, if you want a certain sound, you have to make the investment. So the first one is going to come from a UAD plugin called the Dangerous BAX EQ, or I call it the Dangerous BAX EQ. Is very precise on certain frequencies in either the low or the high end, and you can then boost or cut accordingly. And then I'll just show you the same kind of surgical EQing technique with just a standard stock plugin that comes with the DAW. In this case, it'll be with what came with Logic. So let's have a look at what I'm talking about. Alright, so here we go. I came back to the same song, Trim, which is coming out on 294 Records. I do have a date now. It'll be out June 17th, the entire Beats, Life, and Trim EP. So here's the vocal.
This was Friday evening, he took her out to the movies, and they rode around the park, and all his friends have been telling him, man, when you get married,
So it sounds alright. There's a little bit of hiss in there that I removed using the Dangerous BAX EQ through UAD. And the great thing about this EQ, and again, I apologize, you probably cannot see this up front, but I do encourage that you look it up on the UAD site to see about all of the functionality I'm talking about, and other YouTube videos, of course. But because the bothersome frequency is hissing, I know that's generally up in the higher end of the frequency spectrum. So as I listen to this and engage the EQ,
this was Friday evening, he took her out to the movies,
I just start
and they rode around the park,
I just start playing around with the different frequencies in that high end. And once I pretty much isolate what is the bothersome part of the frequency, and in this case it's the hiss cutting. So now that I've isolated that frequency, here's the dope part about this plugin.
This was Friday
I could
evening,
just
he took her out to the movies,
manipulate
and they
the
rode
output
around the park,
on the far end,
all his
and
friends
then
been
I could get
telling him, man, when
into
you get
the
married, you
specific
gonna get
dBs.
fucking.
And you could hear
Oh, man, that's
it's almost
beautiful
like
life.
I'm filtering
Oh,
it
man,
down,
never had no pussy, so he got
but
up on the damn wheel,
I'm
got
controlling
all his friends,
the
told him how to do
specific
this shit,
frequency that I want to cut off
This
or
was
narrow
Friday
off.
evening, he took her out to the
So that's the BAX technique. You can see you can get right to it very quickly. I love this EQ so much, I saved it as a preset for these situations where I have either an abnormal hiss or a high signal in a vocal sample. I'll show you the other technique, which doesn't necessarily require the investment of this UAD plugin. So here's the standard EQ that comes with Logic Pro X, and a lot of guys know this technique. So I'm going to play the sample again.
This was Friday
where the
evening,
hiss
you know,
is
he
at.
took her out to the movies, you know, and they wrote.
You notice I made a little bump here, but that's in the lower range, so I don't need to bother with that. But what I do want is a bell curve type EQ, and what that allows me to do is to center the frequency that or isolate the frequency that I want to fix. And the way you do that is you up the Q. So you're essentially narrowing the Q. I hope you guys can see this, but you can see with the thing with a bell curve type of EQ, it affects the frequencies around the the frequency spectrum you're looking at. So in this case, as I said earlier, we're kind of up in the 6,000, 7,000 kilohertz range. So I got that bell curve EQ going. I just up the Q itself to narrow in on the frequency, and here we go.
This was Friday evening, you know, he took her out to the movies.
So you can hear
and they rode around.
it sounds a little ringy there, so that's not what I'm going after. I'm going after the hiss in the signal. So what you do is you just sweep across and try and find where the hiss is at. And as I said earlier, I found it around the 6,000 range, right about here. You can hear it a bit. So now that I've found it, I just drop or cut through the DPs in that same frequency and mess with the Q until it sounds, somewhat natural to me. It will affect the other frequencies on either side of the frequency I'm trying to isolate, but because I've isolated that hiss part, I can just play around with it and see how it lies in a mix. And once I find that, I tend to bring in other instruments that I think are kind of playing in the same frequency range, just to see if things are sitting appropriately. So in this case, I'll probably bring in a hi-hat with the vocal because it's around the same place.
This was Friday evening, you know, he took her out to the movies, you know.
You can hear my hi-hat in there.
Park, and
it doesn't sound bad. It doesn't sound like it's too sharp on the ears and making me bleed, so to speak. That is the techniques. There's showed you two different ways to do it. One is on the pseudo high end using that UAD plugin, Dangerous Backs EQ, and the other is just a staple technique that I've seen other engineers do with many different types of EQ that doesn't necessarily cost a lot of money, and they just call it sweeping through the frequency to get to that surgical frequency you want to correct. So I hope that helps. Stay tuned. Keep checking in on me for weekly videos, y'all. I appreciate the support as always. It's your boy Demuir. Peace.